My name is Laura Kent. I'm with Women for a Change, and I'm delighted to have you here today. Can't think of a better place to hold a program with Jim Condos, our Secretary of State, than at a public library. Because if any place is a sort of shrine to our most fundamental democratic values, I think a library is. So I thank the library for making this available and having us here. Women for a Change is a mission is committed to protecting, promoting, and supporting our basic democratic values of liberty and justice for all. And so we are a loosely knit group of women who came together about 6 months ago, and that's what we focus our programming on. And we would love for you to be involved and once again sign in. There have been a number of extraordinary women who are responsible for the founding of Women for a Change. And one of the most extraordinary is Dottie Deans, right here. And many of you know her. She's the former chairman of the Vermont Democratic Party and a key member of Women for a Change. So Dottie, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you, Laura. This is a real, first of all, again, I want to reiterate what Laura said. Thank you all for being here. It's windy, it's cold, it's miserable, it's winter in Vermont. This is a special night for me because when I was involved very heavily in the Vermont Democratic Party, Jim was a very, very good friend. And what is unique, I think, in our group up in Montpelier is that we all try and work together. When Jim is elected, he's not elected because he's not elected as a Democrat. He's elected to serve in the office of Secretary of State for all Vermonters. And I think we all need to be very proud of who he is and what he has done to represent us all. He's been in office, I believe this is his fifth term, and before that he was a state senator from Chittenden. He lives and breathes voters' rights. He has been the president of what is NASS, which is the National Association of State Secretaries of State. Thank you very much. Today, when I was just sort of going through the computer and sort of trying to find some tidbits of information that might hook you in a little bit, it's important to know what a Secretary of State does. One thing that I did find out is that no Secretary of State in the United States is like any other. It's very different in each state. Matter of fact, there are 3 states that don't have a Secretary of State: Alaska, Hawaii, Utah, which I thought was very interesting. There are 35 states that elect the Secretary of State, Vermont being one. 7 states, their Secretaries of State are appointed by the governor. Those states, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Florida, Oklahoma, and Texas. They're appointed by their governor. 3 states are elected by the legislature: Maine, New Hampshire, and Tennessee. Jim will go through some of his duties, what he does here for us in Vermont. So without further ado, Jim Condos, Vermont Secretary.
My speech. Thank you very much. And I can't tell you, I think there's one defining moment when I was a secretary and I was fairly new. I was in DC for our winter meeting, and I was having dinner with the Connecticut Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, Kate Brown, who was the Secretary of State from Oregon, and I can't remember I think it was Eileen, I can't remember her last name. but from North Carolina. And she doesn't have, Eileen did not have elections as part of her portfolio. But anyway, we were sitting there having dinner. This is around 2013. And all of a sudden, Kate's phone went off and she looked at it and she says, I have to take this call. And as she came back off the call, like 2 minutes later, she was white as a sheet. And I said, what's the matter? I thought maybe a death in the family. And she goes, I have to take she was the president of our association that year. And she goes, I have to take the red eye back home. And I said, what's up? And she goes, the governor's resigning tomorrow. And in Oregon, there is no lieutenant governor. She is the one that is in line to be the governor. So the next day, we all texted her and said, did everything go okay? And she goes, well, I don't know. She walked into the governor's office the next morning, and the governor looked up from his desk and looked at her and said, what are you doing here? He was the one that called her to tell her to come home. So anyway, he was under very much a lot of stress. So that was just a really interesting story. I always love to tell it. So let me give you a little bit of my background. And I'm going to go back about 100 years. Nearly 100 years ago, all four of my grandparents emigrated to the U.S. from Greece. My grandfathers came first, and a few years later, after they settled in, they went back and brought their wives over. They all came through Ellis Island. Around that same time, Congress passed what was known as the Emergency Quota Immigration Act, specifically limiting immigration from Southern Europe and Russia. Now, Greece probably wasn't sending us its best and brightest, but most of them coming in were penniless, uneducated, but they were all hardworking and family-oriented. They came to the U.S. for basically the same reason: opportunity and a better life. At the time, there were tremendous persecution singling out Greeks, Irish, African Americans, and Jews. They endured neighbors who didn't want those people moving into their neighborhood. My one grandfather enrolled in the Army so he could speed up his citizenship, and then he became a janitor in Thomas Edison's lab in New Jersey before he went on to buy a diner. Good Greek grandfather. The other became a Finnish carpenter who could build anything. My grandmothers stayed home with the difficult job of raising their kids, and their kids, my parents, aunts, and uncles, contributed to their communities. One became a restaurant manager. Another became a CPA and vice president for Eastern Airlines in New York City. Another was an interior office architect for Citicorp in New York City. I had another uncle who became a bus driver, another one that became a chemist for Bristol Myers, and he worked on perfecting Excedrin and Bufferin. I also had an uncle who was a self-employed home builder, and my mom was an executive secretary for the Dean of Arts and Sciences at UVM. In my generation, my cousins and I became a dentist in New York City, the mayor of Seaside Park, New Jersey, a police officer, a hospital employee, sales reps, realtor, performing arts director in New York City, a teacher, stay-at-home moms, and me as Vermont Secretary of State. To show you let me just give you a real brief description of what my father, when I was first elected to City Council, and I served 18 years on the South Burlington City Council before I served 8 years in the State Senate. And I remember when I was getting sworn in, it's kind of a joke, my father's very emotional, or was very emotional. And at the time, he had tears in his eyes as I was being sworn in as a city councilor. And then when I was sworn in as a state senator, he was visibly crying. However, when I became Secretary of State, and I was taking my parents to the airport, they had retired to Florida by then, and I was taking my parents back to the airport, My father, sitting in the front seat, turns to me and goes, "Do you work for Hillary now?" And I said, "No, Dad, different Secretary of State." And then he's turned back to the front, and we're going another mile, and he turns to me and he says, "Do I now have to call you Mr. Secretary?" And I said, "No, Dad, I'm still Jim or son to you." And at that point, he smacked me on the back of the head and said, "Don't get cocky with me." I am a descendant, their descendant, and I'm a proud second-generation American. As I said, I served 18 years on City Council, 8 years in the State Senate, and now I'm in my 9th year as Secretary of State. So let me tell you a little bit about the Secretary of State's office. Our mission is public protection and transparency. We strive to provide good customer service, efficiency, and productivity. We have transformed the office from 0% online in 2010 to now over 95% of the activity is done online. I used to receive, my first 2 years there, I was receiving $1.8 million per year in general fund, which is taxpayer money, to operate my office. And it was a convoluted accounting procedure where they give it to us on July 1st, and then on the following June 30th, they would sweep whatever was left. After 5 minutes of my first budget presentation from my admin services director, I realized we don't even need this money. We have plenty of money coming in the form of fees that we really didn't need it. So it took me 2 years to convince the legislature that they could have $1.8 million back that I didn't need. And that's not a knock on the legislature. It was just that there were some things that they were concerned about, like, well, how do we know you're going to stay within your budget? And I said, well, I present a budget, you have to approve it. So I have to stay within it. We focus entirely on restoring integrity and accountability. I push transparency every day since I was first elected. We've updated the open meeting law. We've updated the Public Records Act. We've updated and added an ethics commission. I do a transparency tour every other year. This year we'll be doing it in the fall. And it actually it educates. It's meant to be an education for municipal officials and citizens on open meeting law and Public Records Act. I believe strongly that good government is an open government. So I have 5 divisions. One of them is the Office of Professional Regulation, and I protect the public's health and safety through professional regulation and leading the way with efficient, effective licensing and enforcement systems. So we oversee nursing, everything but the doctors. So every other medical field, we oversee licensing. We do accountants, engineers, tattooists, cosmetologists, barbers, you name it, pretty much. If there's a professional license, we oversee it. The State Archives and Records Management Unit, we preserve and protect our state's most valued history, our public records, and access to those public records, and we work with all of state government. Elections, of course, safeguarding the integrity and accuracy of our elections while increasing voter participation and creating a more effective election administration. And I say that the election administration is an important piece of this. And Dottie can tell you from her days at the party. Then we have corporations where we ensure proper registration and public protection while facilitating business and commerce in Vermont. If you do business in Vermont, you have to register with the Secretary of State's office. And then my admin business office, they make sure we live within our means, that we provide a true accounting of our budgets, and we have the resources needed to provide the services I've just described. I know one of the things that was important, I have 30 plus years of business experience. I worked for a Fortune 100 company. I worked for a family-owned $100 million distribution company here in Vermont. And then I also worked for a regulated utility. So I had a lot of business experience, and I think that one of the things that I focused on was customer service, and I focused on making sure we work within our means, that we stay within our means. I mean that sincerely. I have never been to the legislature in January for budget adjustment, which is when they update their numbers if they need more money because they didn't get enough in the previous July. I've never had to do that, and I pride myself on that. So let's go to the topic that everybody is always concerned about, elections. Let's talk about the historical background first. So since the early days of our founding, when our electorate was limited to white male landowners, our Constitution and laws have been amended at least 10 times, in all to expand voting eligibility. In 1870, we had the 15th Amendment, which prohibited use of a citizen's race, color, or status as a slave as a qualification for voting. In 1920, the 19th Amendment, which this coming year is reaching its 100-year mark, and that's preventing any citizen from voting based on their sex. Women were allowed to vote finally. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment granted Washington, D.C. 3 electoral college votes. In 1964, the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act barred literacy tests, banned overt racial discrimination, required the DOJ to review and pre-approve election law changes in those states with histories of racial disenfranchisement. In 71, we had the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. In 1993, we had the National Voter Registration Act. 2002, the Help America Vote Act. You might all remember the Help America Vote Act was as the result of the post-2000 Florida election debacle. And in 2009, Overseas and Military Vote Act. We have worked hard to pass and enforce these expansions of voting rights over the years. And as a nation, we should be proud and promote greater participation of those that are eligible to vote in our electoral process. Instead, what have we seen in recent years? We've seen many states attempt and succeed in reversing this trend. Since 2011, legislation has or will have or has been introduced or been passed that actually limits voter participation by requiring strict proof of citizenship, mandating strict voter IDs, closing DMV, while at the same time closing DMV offices. This was an important piece that happened in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, the legislature, the I don't mean to get, I'm trying to be careful. The legislature in Wisconsin and the governor passed laws that did a lot of restrictions, including requiring free voter IDs. And anybody could get them for free from the DMV offices. But in the very next budget, they shut down a lot of the DMV offices. They cut the budget. And what it did was require people, especially people, low income, seniors, minorities, students, to have to travel hundreds of miles in order to get to a DMV office that was open. Really, it was a restriction. They also attempted to reduce early voting days, sometimes from 45 days down to 0. They repealed, in some states, election day registration, same-day voter registration, which Maine did that. The Maine governor repealed it, and the legislature repealed it. And then there was a petition by the citizens of Maine, and in the next election, they put it back in. And a lot of states right now, the big push is to restrict student voting, even though we have 2 Supreme Court cases that say students have a right to pick where they want to vote. The most affected of these are young adults, seniors, minorities, and low income. My own mother is now 91 years old, and she has no valid government-issued photo ID. her driver's license, her passport have all expired, and they're no longer would be qualified if you had a strict voter ID requirement. And to have to take her out of the home that she's living in and take her to a DMV office would be problematic. So I've often said in recent years that yes, the very basis and core of our democracy has been under siege. Democracy and access to voting should not be a partisan issue. We must ensure the placing of undue burdens on our rights as U.S. citizens not only is stopped, but is reversed before our democracy is further eroded. And when I talk about voter fraud, the true voter fraud in this country is denying any otherwise eligible American the ability to cast their constitutionally protected right to cast a ballot. That's the real voter fraud. So there have been a couple of attempts in the last year. Last year, the Secure Elections Act, Amy Klobuchar was one of the major sponsors to push the Secure Elections Act forward in Congress. That did not make it through. This year, the House, actually, I understand they're going to be voting on it next week, H.R. 1, and we're hopeful that that will move. We don't know what the likelihood of it passing in the Senate is, but we think that it will pass. Our delegation will be supportive. So I guess my point is, even though it's been bad, there's a silver lining out there. And according to the Brennan Center for Justice, in the last, I think last couple of years, we've had 230 bills that have been filed in 31 states that expand voter rights. So we've actually turned the corner. The courts are starting to knock down a lot of these strict ID requirements and some of the other effects of some of these provisions. And it's going to take time, but we're working on it. As of right now, we have 16 states plus the District of Columbia that have enacted automatic voter registration. Vermont is one of those. And we have 17 states plus the District of Columbia that offers same-day voter registration. My approach, and I'm proud to say, is to work to remove any unnecessary barriers while protecting the integrity of our process. Vermont continues to look for ways to improve access and expand voting opportunities. Our election staff, we have the smallest election staff in the country, 5 people, works hard to preserve the integrity of the campaigns and our elections. They provide a customer-friendly environment to educate and train citizens, voters, candidates, lobbyists, and public officials. We administer the federal and state laws relating to elections. We promote voter registration. We oversee and assist in the conduct of our elections. We work with our town clerks to make sure that they have the information and technology that they need. We provide online campaign finance and lobbyist disclosure systems, which when I took office in 2011, I was told probably would never see that. We did it in about 3 years after that. We also provide continuing ongoing training and support to our 246 town clerks. And here's something that receives some media coverage, but is, I think, really important. When I first took office, the first election that I oversaw, the first general election, was 2012. After that election, it usually takes about 1.5 years for the information to come out. Our election system administration was listed as number 38 in the nation. After the 2014 election, we had moved up to number 16. And after 2014, we actually implemented our new, what we call VEMS, Vermont Election Management System, in the fall of 2015. So after the 16 election, we were now number 1. We're hoping to stay there, but we know a lot of the other states are also improving their systems as well. Vermont's also considered a national leader in the area of cybersecurity, and I can't speak enough about what happened in 2016. The Russians attacked, we know that. The intelligence community of the United States knows that, but their boss doesn't. In 2017, we protected Vermont's voter checklist from a nefarious federal intrusion, and we weren't alone. And I'm speaking specifically about the Trump Commission. They wanted any and every piece of personal information that we had on our voters, everything. We pushed back and said no, as did 44 other states, red states, blue states. In fact, one of the most conservative, Delbert Hosemann from the state of Mississippi, actually was quoted nationally as saying to the president, you could go jump in the ocean if you think I'm going to give that information to you. And by the way, we have ocean front right here in Mississippi. I have been named, since July of this past year, I've been the president of my national association. And just to give you an idea of how powerful our little state is, I'm the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Beth Pierce is the president of the National Association of State Treasurers. And Mike Pichak, who was the president of the financial regulators nationally. So we have a lot of influence over the years. So in the area of cybersecurity, and I'm going to speak in two areas. One is what we're doing nationally, but also what we're doing in Vermont. So nationally, we have been focused since the 2016 election on cybersecurity and protecting the integrity of our elections. In August of 2016, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson called us all to a phone call, to a conference call, and basically said that 21 states had been targeted. Only one of the states was breached, but no votes were changed. They just got into the voter registration database, didn't do anything to it. The press focused on the one state, and I don't mean this as a knock. Somewhere there's a, I don't mean this as a knock here in Vermont, but in any case, the press said they focused on that one state, the national press. And once I became the secretary, the national president, I kept focusing on the fact that you keep talking about the one state, but what about the 20 states that didn't get breached, the 20 states that defended and defended well? Let's hear it for them. Let's thank them for doing their job. So I've hammered on it. We'll see what happens. We had a lot of Department of Homeland Security conference calls leading up to the 2016 election that fall. We started sometime in probably September, October of that year. We had access to the Department of Homeland Security resources, and one of those was a weekly hygiene scan, which they would actually do a scan of our system to see if they could find any vulnerabilities. And we have continued to do that scan weekly since 2016. So, because you never know when an opening will occur, and it is technology. In January of 17, DHS designated state election systems as critical infrastructure. We had no clue what that meant. They didn't tell us. They just named us as critical infrastructure. And it wasn't until June of that year that we actually, at a meeting that we had with them, that they actually let us know what that meant. And it was actually to provide us resources that we could use. Let's see, in August of that year, we created a governing council. I'm currently a co-chair of that governing council. In September of that year, the DHS contacted all 50 states to tell us, remember I said it in the fall of 16, they said there were 21 states. They couldn't tell us which states. They just said there were 21 states. And they said, well, we've notified the victims. And we said, what does that mean? And for instance, what they were doing was notifying the local jurisdiction, the towns who were actually were attacked, not the state. And we couldn't get it through their heads that the state oversees all of this and that we're connected. So anyway, it took almost a year before we actually found out. Vermont was not one of those states. In March of 2018, I testified before a U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and shortly after, Vermont was awarded $3 million for cybersecurity and equipment upgrades. That was part of a $380 million tab that the Congress put forth. I also testified in June of that year before the Senate Rules Committee. All of this is about cybersecurity and how we're working to overcome these issues. And that leads me up to November of 2018. I know the press called me the day after the election, and they said, "So what happened?" And I said, "Nothing." And that's good news. The communication between the federal government and the states has improved significantly. We have local jurisdictions that are involved as well. This is on a national basis. I now have not top secret, but secret clearance, so I can receive classified reports. Before, they couldn't tell me certain things, and if they did, then I couldn't tell my IT people to fix it because they didn't have clearance. So we're in the process of getting more clearance. And here in Vermont, our cyber measures, well, the good news is that here in Vermont, we started in 2013. And we've been focused on cybersecurity ever since. Before the 2016 election, we actually had done a full physical and cyber risk and vulnerability assessment, and that included a penetration test where they actually attack our systems and try to get in. Just prior to the start of the election cycle in April of 2018, we did an additional round of penetration testing. At one point, Vermont Public Radio reporter called me up and he said, "Well, can I get a copy of the report?" I said, "No." And he says, "Well, I'm going to request it as a formal public records request." I said, "That's fine." And then I told him no, he couldn't have it. So we went around and around, and I said, "Look, if I give you a copy of the report, the full report, I might as well put it in an envelope and send it to the Kremlin. And I'm not about to do that." So then he went out and talked to a few experts in cybersecurity, and they said, "He's right, I wouldn't give it to you either." So in April of 2018, we did our Defending Our Democracy public forum up in Montpelier, and it included Department of Homeland Security, the Center for Internet Security, the Agency of Digital Services, the Vermont State Police, and the Deputy Vermont Homeland Security Advisor. And it was a very public meeting. We talked about what we've been working on, what we're doing, without getting into detail. In the summer of 2018, our team participated in the Harvard Belfer Center Election Cybersecurity Tabletop Exercise. That's a mouthful, but it was very informative and was good for our team, and we had many of the states were there. In the summer of 2018, we also implemented two-factor authentication. So for any town clerk or even my own staff, if they wanted to get into the election management system, which is where our voter database is, you had to have a two-factor, just like you do with a bank. So you have to have that second factor to get in. Some of our best practices, this is what I've been speaking about. Paper ballots, voter marked, sealed, and stored for 22 months. Post-election audits within 30 days of the election, and those post-election audits have a high statistical confidence. Our tabulators, we have 135 towns that use tabulators. Any town over 1,000 voters has to use a tabulator for counting their votes. Those tabulators are not connected to the internet in any way. Wi-Fi, hardwire, remote access, no way possible. We do penetration tests. All of our IT solutions in the Secretary of State's office have been replaced since 2012, which means that we have better IT and a stronger cybersecurity background. We continue those DHS cyber hygiene scans on a weekly basis. We have firewalls in front of every door to our system, every portal. We're a member of the MS ISAC, that's Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center. The federal government's great with initials and stuff. Vermont is a member. Every state actually is a member of MS ISAC, but we chose, because we're on our own system separate from the state, to join as a separate member. We're also a member of the EI ISAC. Vermont is a member of the EI ISAC, which during the election we had what was called the National, boy they're great with titles, National Cyber Situational Awareness Room for Election Day Dashboard. And that, my IT people had that up on their screen so that they could see what was going on around the country. It actually was a good thing for us. We blacklist suspected nefarious internet addresses. We have the two-factor authentication. We do a daily backup of our voter registration database. So every night our system is backed up. That means that should our system, by some, we think almost impossible, get hacked, we would just go back 24 hours and be able to reset it. We'd only lose 24 hours worth of data. We also have a system where we don't actually, our office doesn't make additions or deletions to the voter checklist. It's done at the local level. So it shows up when something comes in on our online database or through automatic voter registration, our system automatically reads their address and zip code and then sends it to the town clerk of jurisdiction, and the town, it'll show up on their dashboard in the morning, and they're able to then review it and approve it. So it's that second layer that's there. We have election day registration. We have automatic voter registration. We did town clerk training last summer, which is what we call Secure the Human. We had 235 out of 246 towns that took that. It was about a 2-hour Secure the Human basic cyber technology information. And we will continue to support and educate our municipal officials and Vermonters in general about election issues. I had worked, as I said, we got $3 million last year. I had worked with, in the previous December, so a little over a year ago, I had contacted Senator Leahy, and I said, hey, there was $380 million that was never appropriated, that is left over from the Help America Vote Act of 2002. So in 2002, Help America Vote Act was passed. They appropriated, or they approved $3.9 billion, and all but 10% of it had been distributed to the states. So I said to Senator Leahy, this would be the easiest and fastest way to get this money to the states, and this is a year ago, so it was to get the money to us quickly so we can use this to try to shore up our systems further. He agreed, and being that he was number 2 on Senate appropriations, he helped shepherd that through. I know I had help from Senator Burr of North Carolina, Senator Langford of, I think, Arkansas, Senator Klobuchar, all were supportive of it, and our share was $3 million. So that really helped us a lot. And we have 5 years to spend that $3 million, so we're working on it, but it's going to take some time. We have a plan. So on our voter registrations, so for calendar year 2018, we actually added about a little over 52,000 newly registered voters. Now, what used to be, prior to about 3 years ago, Mail-in, town office, and voter registration drives used to be the bulk of it. And so these numbers have really changed drastically. Mail-in was less than 800. Other agencies, less than 300. Town offices, a little over 10,000. And voter registration drives, a little less than 800. Online voter registration, which now I think there's 38 or 40 states that actually have online voter registration. We had over 12,000. Through the DMV, over almost 20,000. And on election day, same day voter registration, we had over 8,000. So you can see the complete change in how we're doing business. This past election, we actually began or implemented our new accessible voting. So if you knew, for accessible, we have a mandate from the federal government to provide an accessible voting system, mainly for visually impaired. And it consisted of an analog phone line with a touch button phone with big numbers on it. That was approved back in around 2006. I can tell you that most of the town clerks hated that. So, well, and actually, here's the sad part. It cost us $500,000 an election to run that system, and we had 20 voters use it. But it was a federal mandate. Well, we now have a new system in place. It's a tablet. It's a touch screen, but it prints an actual ballot, so you can actually put a regular ballot into the printer, and it'll mark that ballot for those, and it's for any physical impairment, whether you're blind or visually impaired, whether you motion, you can do sip straw. It's really fully ADA compliant, and it has really made life a lot easier. And it's a self-contained unit. It comes in a briefcase. And, you know, I mean, it was brand new this year. So we haven't got the numbers yet, but my understanding is we had more than 20 people use it. So, but the other beauty of it is that we can actually use, because I actually went and met with the Visually Impaired Association to find out why more people weren't using our system, the original system. And they said, because it is problematic, and they said most people are voting from home. They can do it right on their kitchen table. They can have help. You know, their spouse or sibling or child can help them, and it's easier for them. The new system actually will allow them to go through into a portal to vote and then print on regular paper and then mail that into us, their ballot. It actually prints their ballot, mails it into us, and then we can, you know, the typical one from each party, justices of the peace can transfer the information to a regular ballot to put it through the system. So we think that this is the future. We're also looking at how we can utilize this perhaps with our overseas and military voters. I did have a former representative, Rachel Weston, who lives in Turkey now, and she used the portal to basically print her ballot and vote on it, and then mailed it back to her town clerk. So, and what we're trying to find is a secure way to be able to send that ballot back to us rather than have to go through the mail, which the mail is not always the most expedient way of doing it, but that's what we have. Vermont law does require a paper ballot at the end of the day. So for every vote we have that's cast in Vermont, we do have a paper ballot. And the town clerks will seal those in bags, and they store those for 22 months in case there's a need for them to be opened. I'm going to stop there, and I'll take any questions. And we got one right away.
Jim, how many, in 2016, how many actual cases of fraud prompted the Presidential Commission on Elections?
It's a great question. We don't know. Justin Levitt from Loyola University in California actually did a study from 2000 to 2014. He looked at local, state, and federal races. He looked at over 1 billion votes that had been cast and found potentially 31 cases out of 1 billion. So 31 cases is 0.000000001%. It's a very small percentage. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there is no voter fraud in this country. What I will say is there is no systemic mass voter fraud going on, despite what we hear sometimes in the national press. In fact, I find it ironic that the person who screams the loudest is not saying a word about what happened in North Carolina. But in any case, the new attack has come to absentee and early voting. That's where the new attack is saying that that's the area that is most vulnerable. And I suppose you could say that, but you know what? Senator Leahy asked me one time about how confident I feel about voter fraud being relatively non-existent. And I said, well, look, Senator, in the 2016 election, we had 68% of our registered voters that voted. I have a tough enough time getting people to vote once, never mind twice. And he uses that on the floor of the Senate all the time. He said, I'm going to use that. Yes?
Thank you. This is very informative. I'm curious to know, I moved to Vermont a few years ago from New Hampshire, just across the river. And when I did that, I went into the town office of the town I had lived in New Hampshire, Enfield. And I said, I've moved to Vermont now. I'm living in Heartland. Can you take me off the voter rolls? Because I couldn't register. I forget which order I did it in, but I went to both offices. And they said, no, we can't do that. They said they have to notify us that you registered there. And I felt really weird about that because I felt like I was sort of being set up for, is that normal? Is that
Well, let me ask you a question first of all. You said you were from New Hampshire?
Yeah.
Okay. So right now there is no system necessarily in place that allows us to do any kind of check on that between states. There is a program called ERIC, electronic, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's a consortium of right now about 26 states. We're hoping to be the 27th come this summer. And basically it's a very secure system and it's a nonpartisan and the states own the system. And we are able to send our voter databases to this system and they'll do whatever they do. But for instance, here in Vermont, if you go to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Hospital and let's say you die over there, it's going to be a while before it gets back to your Vermont town clerk. The system is not really automated in any way. What we can do within the state of Vermont is if you go from one town to another within the state and you go to register, when you go to register in your new town, it will show up on the town clerk's database that, oh, you're registered already in this other town. And she can, by a click of a button, send a message to the other town to remove you from that list. Only the town clerk for the town that you're in can either add or delete a name from the list. That's part of the process of making sure it's secure. So I don't have a good answer for you, but
it's set up within the state.
That system is set up within the state. We don't have a national database or anything, which a lot of us are probably relatively happy about overall. I think there's a lot of concern about personal information, and we're trying to be very protective of that information. But it does raise the question, and we're working hard. You know, like I get emails. Most of the one state that always seems to send me emails, remove this person from your list, is from Connecticut. They seem to have a system in place that, well, actually, I can tell you why, because they have the same system we do. But they will send me an email, and then I send it to my admin people, and then they will forward it to the town clerk to remove such a so-and-so because they moved. One of the things that we've learned over time is people, when they move, whether it's within a town, within the state, whatever, when they move, people have a tendency to go fix their driver's license. But they don't have a tendency to remember to do their voter registration. That's why the automatic voter registration, where we actually receive on a nightly basis information from the voter registration, from the licensing division of anybody that came in that day. And we'll get the whole file, and then we just match it against what we have. We're able to correct names, addresses, locations, so it really helps us make a much more accurate system. One of the things I always get, my opponent in this last election said to me, I was on VPR with him, and he said, well, he says, I know for a fact there's dead people on the voter checklist. And my response was, there will always be dead people on the checklist, as there is in every state in the union. It's just a fact of life. Dead people have a tendency not to call us up and tell us that they've died. So, yes.
You said that 68% of registered voters came out and voted, which seems like a higher than national average by quite a lot. But how do you get 90% of people to vote? What? I don't understand why people don't vote.
I don't either.
Australia, right? Isn't
Well,
that
There's a law there, yes.
right?
You have the power. Yeah, it's a great question, and to be honest with you, Vermont has one of the highest percentages of eligible Vermonters that are registered now, and that's partly because of the automatic voter. So we have a very high percentage. We're in the 90s of those eligible, and our belief is that the more we can make sure people are registered, the easier it is. The other piece of this, which is not really so much an elections issue, at one point I was the chair of Senate Education, and I was the chair when No Child Left Behind was coming into play. No Child Left Behind essentially eliminated civics education. Not explicitly, but they just said you will focus on reading and arithmetic or whatever. So a lot of the schools said, well, if that's the case, we don't have to do this. And a lot of the schools got rid of civics education. I think that is a huge downfall for us. I go and speak to high schools, to middle schools and elementary schools. I usually come almost every election cycle here to Woodstock to speak to the kids here. And I think, that's where we're really missing the boat. But that's why, and what we did was, okay, so in 2009, actually it started in about 2007, but it took until 2010 election, Vermont actually had a constitutional amendment to allow 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they would be 18 by the general election. Well, when we were implementing automatic voter registration, we realized that we were going to miss all those kids that were 16 because it's 4-year license. So it's going to be, we wouldn't get them till they were 20. So what we do now, from when we get the information from DMV, we actually park those that are not eligible to vote in the general election off to the side. And it's basically the computer program will pick up when their birth date is, and as soon as they're eligible, it'll kick it over into the automatic registration side. So we are capturing those students now, which I think is a good thing. Studies have shown that if young students, high school students, start voting when they're eligible, they will continue to vote. If they don't and wait till they're in their 30s or 40s, they'll probably never vote. So it's a hard one, short of, as Allison said, short of actually requiring
Right.
and having a penalty if you don't.
Jim, is it the only country that requires, I mean, you're penalized, you're fined if you don't vote in Australia?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I'm just aware of Australia. I also know that like in Afghanistan, you have to dip your finger into the ink, but, you know, I mean, I know there's a lot of places where, I don't know if it's required, but you're encouraged. Yes.
So I moved to Vermont in May, and then registered to vote right away. Couldn't figure out how to register to vote in the Democratic Party. So I'm an independent.
Okay, so here's, first of all, here in Vermont,
We don't register.
we don't register by party. There is no party registration, period. The only registration that occurs, if you want to call it a registration, is the presidential primary once every 4 years. At that point in time, when you go up to the polling location, you will say, I'm here to vote, and they'll say, which party would you like? And they'll record that. That was back in the early 1980s. It was the legislature working with all the parties, and they came up with that system. The parties wanted party registration, but Vermont, being independently minded, did not want to go that route. So this was a compromise. So the presidential primary is the only one where you actually have to declare which ballot you want. It doesn't mean, if you pull the Democratic ballot, that you're a Democrat. It just means over time, if they look at the history, they can see John Smith voted a Democrat 3 times and 1 time as a Republican.
There was nothing on, I couldn't find anything on the website. I cannot tell you how many fights I got and people on Facebook. Bernie should have registered as a Democrat, you know, the whole.
Well, there is no party registration in Vermont. The other time, when we have our general election primary, which is a party primary, that's really a party nomination process, you will be handed 3 ballots. And you can only vote 1 and you discard the other 2. We don't know which is which.
Robocalls fall into your purview in any way, whether it's elections or some other?
Not really. Not really.
But Sherman, if you're getting them, you should register with the AG, call the AG's consumer protection line, because they want to hear if you're getting, because they track them. And the AG's office would love to know which one you're getting.
That 68% voter turnout is for a general election. On a primary
It's very low.
or, pardon me?
It's very low in the primary.
Very low for the primary, and embarrassingly low is at town meeting. If there is not an issue that's going to bring a lot of people out, your turnout there can be under 40%.
Oh, town meeting, we've seen it as low as single digits.
And I'm just going to say, and if the weather is bad on that Tuesday, you're lucky to get 10%.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And of course, some towns where you actually have town meeting where you actually have to go. I was from South Burlington. I grew up in South Burlington, and in '72 we went from being a town to being a city, mainly because we had a really hot issue that was before the voters, and when they had town meeting, they were swamped with people. They moved it from City Hall to, let's see, the auditorium in the gym, in the high school, and then they ended up going into the gym. And there were hundreds of people showing up to discuss this bill, or this legislation, and they decided we can't do this anymore. So we left being a town meeting place to being strictly an Australian ballot. But it's kind of interesting, because when we used to have our general election primary, which used to be the 2nd Tuesday of September, and we couldn't make the deadline to have ballots ready for 45 days before the election that were mandated by the federal government. I actually got sued. As, even though I had nothing to do with it, it's up to really the town clerks to make sure they get their ballots out. But I got sued, and we settled with the federal government and basically with Department of Justice, and we had to move our date. So it went from the second Tuesday of September to the fourth Tuesday of August. That still was not giving, we had a recount one year, a statewide recount. They left us with 3 days from the time the court finished the count to, because we go to the court, it comes out of my hands and goes right to the court. We had 3 days from the time the court issued its decision to have the ballots ready by that Friday. The court decision came out on a Tuesday. So then we asked the legislature to move it, actually I wanted it even earlier, but to move it to the second Tuesday of August. We just had the highest percentage of voters in a primary. We were told having it earlier in August was going to kill the primary, that we wouldn't have very much turnout, and we had the strongest turnout we've had in years. So, and I always tell people it depends on who's, you got to look at your candidates and you know, issues that are on that ballot, and I think even at the local level, the same thing. Who are the races all uncontested, or are there real serious contests going on, or is there a money issue that people want or don't want? Those kinds of things. Sir.
I have a two-part question. One is, in the state of Washington, now it may be the city of Seattle, I'm not sure, but they are giving up polling places, they're no longer using polling places, that you in some way drop your ballot in some kind of box that is kind of like a U.S. postal box around either the state or the city. And then the other question I have is, Canada does their polling place and running of elections with a third party. Am I correct in saying that?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure how Canada does theirs.
Okay. How about the Washington?
So, state of Washington, state of Oregon, and the state of Colorado have 100% mail. So what they do is they send a ballot to every registered voter on their list.
Okay.
It's not cheaper.
Right.
There's an expense to that. So I just want to be clear, because think about it.
Yeah.
I said we had 68% in the last election. That means 32% didn't. So if we had sent ballots to them, it would have been a waste. Having said that, they also have high voter turnout. And what most of them are doing, most of those 3 states, and I'm not 100% sure how it works yet, but they are having what they call vote centers, where people drop their ballots off anywhere. And then they bring them to a central location and run the ballots through a machine.
So they have a choice of mailing to a specific place, or they can go to a place and drop the ballot.
Yep. And I believe they can also show up at the polls. That some places do continue to have polls. So kind of the future, I don't mean the future for Vermont necessarily, but the future in a lot of places is they're looking at having vote centers. So strategically placed, you might have a vote center here in Woodstock, and you could be from anywhere in the area. It doesn't have to be just a Woodstock voter. Right. You show up, you tell them, you know, here's my information, and they say, yep, you're right here, and you will be given, they will print a ballot on demand, and then you can vote and just slip it into the box, and it gets counted later. There's a lot of that. I mean, we still have to work out, if that's going to happen, you still have a lot of logistics that have to be worked out, but that's one way of looking at it right now.
Would you also comment on what's been going on in Georgia, and you know what your feelings might be about how things were handled there in this past summer?
They were handled horribly, to put it bluntly, and you know, I know Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State there, who's now the governor. I know him well. I know he has opposed many best practices. They had touchscreen voting with no paper backup. And there are only about 10 states left with no paper backup that are still using touchscreen technology. Of those, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia have already had either governor's executive orders or passed by their legislature. New Jersey passed it by the legislature to move away from those touchscreen technology. And the issue with the touchscreen technology is you might have a name and then have a button that says for this name and you touch that, but it could actually be doing the next guy down or something, the next person on the list. You don't know, and there's no paper backup. So there's nothing to check. And I've always questioned, so how do you do an audit? I mean, we actually, when we do an audit, we pick a certain number of towns, we do 100% of the ballots in their bag, 100% of the races on that ballot. And we can tell. And we've never had a problem since 2006. I don't know how they do, what they have to do is press a button and it prints out a new sheet that says, here's the vote totals. But how do you compare that? You don't know what, you know, I would actually be really concerned if that vote total was different than the original one. So, but it is a problem. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if there's a system, or can there be a system within the schools so they know when a student is turning 17 or turning 18, that there's some way to automatically send them a registration form or information?
Well, there isn't. We've talked about how we can do that. I tried to talk to the selective service to see, because they know when boys are turning 18. And I said, well, can we get that information so we can send them a voter registration or tell them where they can go? Nope. So in any case, there is no system in place, and that's why the automatic voter registration has become the most viable, because if they have a driver's license or a permit or a personal ID, we will get that information.
And we also try and do 1 or 2 voter registration drives at the high school every one.
Yeah, I mean, different schools do. Brattleboro has a great system. They have their, I don't know, I don't think it's called political science, but they have a social studies teacher in Brattleboro who really pushes hard on his students to register. I know I've been up to speak to Missisquoi. I've been down here to Woodstock. So there are a number of schools that are trying to do what they can to get kids to vote. And I know some of the town clerks actually go out, just like a lot of the town clerks will go to senior homes to register people to vote. They will also go to schools as well.
Just like you commented on Georgia, can you comment on North Carolina?
Disaster. My counterpart down there has nothing to do with elections. It's done by a state board. But I will tell you that what occurred there really disturbs me. And that nobody, this guy apparently felt he knew what he was doing. He figured a way around, and that's why it's incumbent, you know, Allison Clarkson is on the committee of jurisdiction in the Senate, and, you know, I work with her committee pretty much every day during the session, you know, to try to refine, and like we're having an election omnibus bill this year to fix little things that we find as the year goes on, and especially after an election, we'll find things that we need to correct that's in statute. The State Board of Elections down there did the right thing by calling for a new election. It was clearly a tainted election, and you didn't have to be a genius to see that. But I think what was really the telling point was when the candidate's own son, who happened to be an assistant DOJ attorney, sat there and said, I warned my father about this. And, you know, I mean, he said, I love my parents, but this was wrong. And it was the next morning that the candidate said, call for a new election.
And is he running? Is there some
That
question
hasn't
about
come
that?
up yet.
It's unclear he's gonna be allowed to run again.
He's also ill.
I would question whether the party will let him run again. Yes, Dottie?
No, I just, finding out that there are 3 states, Utah, Alaska, and Hawaii, that don't have secretaries of state, who takes the responsibility in those?
Well, actually, the lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor is the acting secretary of state, if you want to call it. So and every state's really, Dottie said this, but every state's different as to what the duties are. Not every state. I think there's 38 out of the 50 states that have elections under the Secretary of State. We're considered chief elections officers. So it's different. You know, I have corporations, business services, I have OPR, the professional regulation, and the state archives. Some states don't have state archives. Some states, Minnesota has, I'm trying to remember, but every state's different, and it really, you know, you have some states where there's a state board of election. Rhode Island, the Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, actually sort of oversees the elections, but it's actually run by the State Board of Elections. So she has to work with them. So it's really, every state's different. Every state's different. Yes?
Out of curiosity's sake, with your different things like licensing and elections, what is the breakdown of the time you spend on various different things? Assuming, obviously, it probably changes.
Well, I think for me, elections I probably spend a lot of my time there. But it varies from time to time. I mean, you know, during the 5 months of the legislative session, we're over at the legislature on all of our divisions. But, you know, for instance, the Office of Professional Regulation is my biggest. I have 75 employees, 35 of them are at the Office of Professional Regulation. 19 of them are at the State Archives and Records Management Unit. 5 in corporations, 5 in elections, and then 5 for the administration. So it varies. I mean, I could probably, I know we have a number that's assigned to the admin because they have to pay for my salary and they take a little bit from each division. And for my deputy and stuff, so it varies, and it depends really on the year, so.
I have a follow-up question, which is, do you get a lot of flack about the open meeting law?
Yes. Yes. No, it's not flack for me.
Just a quick question. I wanted to hear what you had to say about polling hours. Here in our area, Windsor is an anomaly in that the polls there don't open till 9 a.m. and so I know from petitioning there that a lot of working folks aren't able to vote because they aren't able to make it back from, you know, Lebanon or Hanover, wherever they were, in time to vote after work. And so the polls not opening till 9 means a segment of folks, you know, they'll come early thinking they can vote because so many other most of the other towns have earlier polling.
This is on our elections, our miscellaneous elections bill. Actually, this is one of the issues we are taking up is uniform hours. And it's a question because, you know, smaller towns, it's a burden. As Mary knows better than all of us, it's a big challenge. And so we have towns in Windsor County that don't open until 10. Wow. Plymouth and Reading, I don't think open until 10. And we open at 7. So it's, we're balancing that and listening, hearing from town clerks and anybody who has an election issue, this is the time to let me know. Or Jim, because we're looking at all the things we may want to change.
State statute actually requires a town to open between the hours of 5 a.m. and 10 a.m. They can open any time they want in those hours. They have to be open by 10, and they all close at 7 p.m. So that's the same deadline for everybody. And actually, Vermont law, we do not accept any ballots that are received after 7 p.m. in the clerk's hands after 7 p.m. on election night. So if it comes in the mail, and even though it's got a postmark, 3 days before, it's not accepted if it arrived after 7 p.m. on election night.
So, but the one plus is we may have, different hours of opening, but we have 45 days to vote
That's
for
the other
the
point.
election. And
So
I think we have to remind people that we have an extraordinarily long early voting period.
So we do have, we have the longest early vote period in the country. There are a few other states that have the same as us. And that came about because in 2009, when the Overseas and Military Vote Act, better known as UACAVA, when that passed, and it required that ballots be sent to military and overseas voters, expats, if we had the request before the 45th day, they had to go out by the 45th day. Vermont used to be a 30-day early vote period, and Vermont legislature decided that, well, if it's good enough for our overseas and military voters, we're making it the same for everybody. So they made the 45-day period for early vote period. So we do have a long period. I know that there has been some discussion about possibly requiring a Saturday or Sunday just prior to the election, but that's not something I've requested, but I know that there are some legislators who would like to see that happen. But we now have, with Election Day registration, anybody can register and vote on Election Day up till 7 p.m. It used to be, the cutoff used to be the Wednesday before. Yes?
Do you oversee the Vermont Consumer Privacy Protection Act? Is that you?
No.
Well, that's the AG's
That's the
office.
Attorney General.
Okay, thank you.
Jim, do you foresee any time that we would have a national holiday on voting day to encourage more?
That may be a discussion that'll happen in HR 1, which is going to probably be voted on next week. I personally support that. I think it would be, I think the problem will be, some people will want to do it as a state level, but I think that we really should do this as a national aspect, at a national level. My personal feeling is we should do it. Any other questions?